Ever wished you had like a system for making decisions? One that's not only more logical, but actually gets better over time. Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore today. We're diving into the principles of one of the most successful investors ever, Ray Dalio. You know, the guy behind Bridgewater, that massive hedge fund. And we'll see how he built it all based on this radical idea of truth and transparency. Plus, we'll get into how he systematized his decision-making process, like literally made it a science. Ready to jump in?
You know, it's fascinating how Dalio's principles went viral before his book even came out. Over 3 million downloads. Can you believe that? Shows you how hungry people are to learn from his kind of success. And what's cool about Dalio's book is it's not just some list of rules. He actually takes you through his journey, like the whole story, warts and all. You see the wins, the setbacks, the whole thing, and you really get a sense of how those experiences shaped his thinking, made him who he is. So let's start at the beginning. With Dalio's childhood, this guy was like a mini entrepreneur from the age of 8. Paper route, shoveling snow, anything to make a buck.
Sounds like the kind of kid who just had to figure things out on his own. And that drive definitely carried over to his trading career. One of his early lessons came from betting against the Nifty 50. These were super popular stocks back in the 70s. Everyone thought they were a sure thing. But Dalio saw it differently. He's like, wait a minute. When everyone's thinking the same way, those expectations are probably baked into the price already. This experience taught Dalio a crucial lesson. When everyone believes the same thing, it's often already priced in, creating opportunities for contrarian investors. And it really kickstarted his lifelong obsession with studying history, to spot those market patterns. Then comes a huge turning point, the 1971 Nixon shock. Nixon takes the US dollar off the gold standard. And Dalio thinks the market's going to tank, totally crash. But guess what? The market jumps up 4%. Talk about a wake-up call. This moment really drives home the point for Dalio that, hey, most things have happened before. He realizes how important it is to understand history, those cause and effect relationships, so you can actually predict what might happen in the future.
But even with this awesome insight, Dalio hits a major roadblock in 1982, a massive market crash that almost wipes him out. He'd been so sure of his predictions that he actually went on Wall Street Week and declared there would be no soft landing. Ouch! Talk about a lesson in humility. This setback forced him to confront his own overconfidence and really dive deep into the historical data. It's like he went through that classic belly of the whale experience, like in the hero's journey. He realized that to get exceptional results, you got to push your limits. And sometimes, you're going to stumble. But it's not about the fall. It's about getting back up. This whole experience was a turning point for Dalio and for Bridgewater, too. Speaking of Bridgewater, let's talk about how this unique firm came to be. It definitely wasn't all smooth sailing. Dalio faced what he called an intractable investment problem. He knew there was a ton of info out there, way more than one person could handle. So he needed a system that could process it all, make sense of it. And this is where things get super interesting. He starts developing algorithms. Basically, he's systematizing his decision-making process, running these algorithms alongside his own judgment, as a test. And what does he find? The computer starts making better calls. Not because it's smarter, but because it can crunch massive amounts of data, way faster. And without all that emotional baggage we humans carry around, this becomes the foundation for Bridgewater's flagship fund, Pure Alpha, which has consistently outperformed the market. Pure Alpha uses a quantitative investment strategy to generate returns that aren't tied to traditional markets, kind of doing its own thing. It's a testament to the power of taking emotion out of the equation when you're investing. But building a system like that, it's not just about algorithms. It's about the people, too. Dalio realized early on that to make this whole thing work, he needed the right people, the right team. He talks about building the machine of Bridgewater. And finding the right people for that machine, well, it was even more important than having perfect processes. And to do that, he had to face some tough truths about himself, about how he was leading. This is where his idea of radical truth and transparency comes in. He realized to create a true idea meritocracy, everyone had to feel safe to speak their mind, openly and honestly, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. This wasn't just some feel-good philosophy. He actually put systems in place to make it happen. He started with something called an issue log. It was basically a way to make sure problems were brought to light and dealt with. If something went wrong, you had to log it in the issue log, no matter how small. No sweeping things under the rug allowed. It's interesting, he actually calls the issue log their first management tool. But the point wasn't to punish people. It was to make sure mistakes were out in the open, so that everyone could learn from them. But even with this radical truth and transparency thing, Dalio realized there's this internal struggle we all face. The logical you versus the emotional you. He calls this the two yous. And he says how we navigate that conflict is the biggest driver of our behavior. It really makes you think about how often our emotions hijack our decisions, even when we know better. So how did Dalio actually put these principles into practice at Bridgewater? Well, he came up with some pretty unconventional methods. One that really stands out is what he calls baseball cards for his employees. He literally created cards that listed each employee's strengths and weaknesses, like stats on a baseball card. The goal was to make sure the right people were in the right roles based on their actual abilities. Just like you wouldn't want a weak hitter batting cleanup in baseball, right? You wouldn't put someone who's not detail-oriented in a job that requires, like, crazy precision. It's a radical approach, but it's all about maximizing how well that Bridgewater machine works. Dalio also recognized that, hey, people think differently. He talks about that classic blind men and the elephant problem, where everyone's looking at the same thing but seeing something totally different because of their perspective. He wants people to move past that, to acknowledge those differences in thinking styles and actually value them. He even started using personality tests like the Myers-Briggs to understand his employees better. He was fascinated by how people's brains are wired differently and how that affected their decision-making. And he wasn't afraid to use that knowledge to build better teams. It's like he was constantly searching for ways to optimize not just the processes at Bridgewater, but the people themselves. It makes you think how much of our own success or failure is tied to how we think and how we interact with people who think differently. But Dalio's focus on personal evolution goes beyond just understanding thinking styles. It extends to how he manages people. He's a big believer in constant feedback, but not the sugar-coated kind. He calls it evaluating accurately, not kindly. He says that ultimately accuracy and kindness are the same thing. It's about being honest, even when it's tough, because that's what helps people grow. He also really emphasizes avoiding micromanaging. He believes in training and testing people thoroughly, then letting them run with it. His goal is to create a culture where people can think independently and make decisions without needing their hand held every step of the way. It's about empowering people to reach their full potential. So what can we learn from all of this? It's clear that Dalio's success isn't about some magic formula. It's about understanding people and how to build systems that actually play to their strengths. It's about embracing radical truth and transparency, even when it's hard. And it's about always striving for personal evolution, for yourself and the people you work with. That's a pretty powerful message. Now, Dalio doesn't just talk about principles in some abstract way. He actually came up with a 5-step process he uses for every decision. And guess what? This is something you can totally use in your own life too. First things first, you got to set clear goals. It might seem basic, but seriously, you'd be surprised how many people skip this step. Or they're just not specific enough about what they're actually aiming for. Next up, you got to identify the problems that are blocking you from reaching those goals. And this is where that radical truth and transparency thing becomes super important. You can't solve problems if you don't even admit they exist, right? Step 3 is all about diagnosing those problems, like really getting to the root cause. Dalio says most people just stop at the surface level, But you got to keep asking why until you find the real issue hiding underneath. Only then can you move on to step 4. Designing solutions that actually address the root cause. And finally, step 5 is all about execution, making it happen. Dalio's a big believer in having clear metrics so you can track your progress. He says, great planners who don't execute their plans, they're going nowhere. Now, that 5-step process might sound pretty logical, right? But Dalio takes it a step further. He adds this really interesting element called believability weighting. It's basically figuring out who's most likely to be right when you're facing a tough decision. Who has the most credibility on that specific topic? And it's not always the boss or the most experienced person, you know what I mean? Believability weighting is about looking at someone's track record, their reasoning, how clearly they explain their thinking. Dalio even built systems at Bridgewater to formalize this process, using algorithms and data to weight people's opinions based on how often they've been right in the past. Kind of like harnessing the wisdom of the crowd, but making sure the smartest voices are amplified. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this all sounds great for a fancy hedge fund, but how does this apply to my life? But Dalio argues that these principles work for any decision, big or small. Whether you're choosing your career, buying a house, even deciding what to have for dinner, it's all about taking a more systematic approach. Being logical and taking out as much emotion as possible. And it's about seeking out different perspectives, even if they challenge your own assumptions. Might be a different way of thinking, but hey, it's hard to argue with Dalio's success. Now, beyond just making decisions, Dalio really digs into how to build a strong culture. He's all about embracing mistakes as learning opportunities. He even says, don't feel bad about your mistakes or those of others. Love them. Aha. That's a pretty bold statement, right? But his point is that mistakes are going to happen. They're inevitable. And if you create a culture where people are terrified of messing up, well, they're never going to take risks or come up with truly innovative ideas. He also talks about how important clear communication is and being able to disagree in a thoughtful way. He believes that conflicts are actually essential for great relationships, both in your personal life and at work, because they force you to align on your principles and work through those differences. It's about having those tough conversations, but in a way that's respectful and productive. He even gives you guidelines for how to disagree effectively, based on how much you actually know about a topic. It's all about creating an environment where the best ideas win, no matter who came up with them. Now, you might be wondering, okay, how do you actually put all of this into practice? It sounds pretty intense. Okay, well, Dalio believes in using tools and protocols to shape how work gets done. He's big on having those principles embedded in the tools themselves. At Bridgewater, they use a bunch of different tools. They have a DOT system for collecting feedback, and remember those baseball cards we talked about. Those are part of it too. These tools aren't just about tracking data, they're about making those principles real, actionable. They create a culture where everyone's playing by the same rules. But Dalio also acknowledges that tools are only as good as the people using them. He talks about finding the right people, then constantly training, testing, evaluating, and sorting them. It's this ongoing process of personal evolution, both for individuals and for the organization as a whole. He's not afraid to make tough calls if someone isn't a good fit, even if they're super talented. It's all about making sure everyone's rowing in the same direction and pulling their weight. Dalio's also big on having clear roles and responsibilities. He calls these responsible parties. For every single goal, there should be one person who's ultimately accountable. This cuts down on confusion and makes sure decisions get made quickly and efficiently. He's a big believer in delegating effectively, but not being totally hands-off. He says great managers know the difference between delegating the details and being too removed from what actually matters. It's about finding that balance, empowering your team, but also staying on top of things. Even with all these systems and processes in place, Dalio knows that things won't always be perfect. He talks about how important it is to notice problems and not just brush them aside. He said problems are like coal being thrown into a locomotive engine. Burning them up is what actually pushes you forward. It's about creating a culture where people aren't afraid to speak up when they see something wrong, and where problems are seen as opportunities to learn and get better. He's really focused on diagnosing those problems correctly, like getting to the root cause. He has these questions he uses like, is the outcome good or bad? And who is responsible for the outcome? It's about being systematic and thorough, not just putting a Band-Aid on the symptoms. Once you've figured out the problem, then it's time to design a solution that actually works. Dalio wants people to visualize different options and really think through the potential outcomes, including those second and third order consequences. It's about taking that long-term view, thinking about the ripple effects of your decisions. He also uses regular standing meetings to make sure that important stuff doesn't slip through the cracks. It's about creating rhythm and structure for the organization, keeping things running smoothly. But even with all the planning and problem solving in the world, Dalio understands that unexpected stuff can happen. That's just life. So he talks about the importance of having guardrails in place to protect the organization from potential risks. These guardrails can be policies, procedures, checks and balances, all sorts of things. It's about anticipating those potential pitfalls and putting safeguards in place to minimize them. He also emphasizes having a clear strategic vision. But that doesn't mean being rigid. You got to be willing to adjust as things change. It's about being adaptable and responsive, but without losing sight of the big picture. Now, Dalio's leadership style might not be for everyone. He's super direct, data-driven, and he's not afraid to push people to think differently. But there's no doubt that his principles have been incredibly effective in building Bridgewater into what it is today. What's interesting about Dalio's book, Principles, is that it's not just about work. It's about life, too. He sees these two sets of principles as, totally intertwined. He believes that the same approach that's made him so successful in business can also help us live more fulfilling lives, outside of work. One of his most basic life principles is to embrace reality and deal with it head-on. Dalio calls himself a hyper-realist. He thinks having an accurate view of reality is essential for making smart decisions and achieving good outcomes. He wants us to confront those harsh realities instead of trying to sugarcoat them or avoid them altogether. He says pain is a signal that something's off. It's an effective teacher. It's all about learning from those tough experiences and using them to grow. He also talks a lot about taking responsibility for our own lives. Instead of blaming external circumstances, he writes, life doesn't give a damn about what you like. It's up to you to connect what you want with what you need to do to get it, and then find the courage to carry it through. That's a pretty powerful idea, right? It's about owning our choices and taking action to create the life we actually want. Another key life principle is to be radically open-minded and radically transparent. We already talked about this in the context of work, but Dalio believes these qualities are just as important in our personal lives. Radical open-mindedness helps us learn and evolve. It allows us to see things from all these different perspectives. It's about being willing to challenge our own beliefs and consider other possibilities, even if they make us a little uncomfortable. And radical transparency. Well, that's about being honest with ourselves and others, even when it's hard. It's about building an environment of trust and authenticity. Dalio also talks about understanding how we're wired and how other people are wired too. He's a big believer in those personality assessments, and using those tools to figure out people's strengths, weaknesses, and how they think. He says recognizing those differences is key for building good teams and strong relationships. It's all about understanding that we all see the world a little differently and appreciating those diverse perspectives. He also stresses choosing our habits carefully. He says habits are the most powerful tool we have, and they can either work for us or against us. So it's about consciously developing habits that'll help us reach our goals and build the life we want. Dalio also applies his famous 5-step process to life in general. Remember, set clear goals, identify the problems, diagnose the root causes, design solutions, and then push through to execution. Sound familiar? It's the same 5 steps he uses for decision-making, but now it's for everything. He wants us to approach everything we do in a systematic and thoughtful way. He also wants us to tap into the power of evolution. He sees life as this constant process of learning, adapting, and improving. He tells us to maximize your evolution and to remember no pain, no gain. It's about pushing ourselves to grow and become the best versions of ourselves. And finally, he talks about learning from nature. He thinks we can gain a ton of insight by watching how nature works and applying those principles to our own lives. He writes, reality is optimizing for the whole, not for you. And adaptation through rapid trial and error is invaluable. It's about understanding that we're all part of this bigger system. And to thrive in that system, we got to adapt and evolve. So what's the biggest takeaway from Dalio's principles, both for life and work? It's about being clear, logical, and always striving to get better. It's about embracing reality, being open-minded, and learning from our mistakes. It's about building strong relationships, communicating well, and making decisions based on evidence and logic. It's definitely a challenging approach, but it's also super empowering. It's about taking control of our own lives and shaping the future we want.
It's about realizing that we're all works in progress, and that the journey itself is just as important as the destination. We've covered a ton of ground in this. Look at Dalio's Principles, Life and Work. It's a book that's packed with insights and practical tips, definitely worth checking out again. Dalio even breaks down his principles in detail so you can really explore the areas that speak to you. It's like a roadmap for personal and professional growth. One thing that really stuck with me was Dalio's focus on shared principles, especially in organizations. He writes, people who have shared values and principles get along. People who don't will suffer through constant misunderstandings and conflicts. It makes you think about how crucial it is to align on those values, both in our personal lives and at work. If you're working towards the same goal, but you have completely different beliefs about how to get there, well, that's going to cause some serious friction. So how do you create that alignment? Dalio believes it starts with being honest about your own principles. Then you got to have those open and honest conversations to see if those principles are compatible with the people you're working with.
It's about finding people who share your core values and who are willing to work together towards that shared vision. He also talks about building a culture that encourages thoughtful disagreement and debate. This isn't about blindly following orders. It's about challenging each other to come up with the best solutions together. And this all comes back to that believability weighting thing. It's about making sure the most knowledgeable voices are heard and that decisions are made based on facts and logic, not just who's in charge. It's a radical approach, but it's clearly worked for Dalio and Bridgewater. Dalio reminds us that we're all works in progress. He's always learning, evolving, and refining his own principles, and he wants us to do the same. So if Dalio's ideas have resonated with you, I definitely recommend checking out Principles, Life and Work. It's a challenging read, but it's also incredibly rewarding. Who knows, you might discover some insights that help you on your own journey. That's all for this episode. If you enjoyed our exploration of Ray Dalio's principles, hit that subscribe button. We'll be back with more insights and aha moments from the world of knowledge.